Okay, hi. So it's late in the day and we're starting late, so I'll try to keep it short, sweet, and kind of late. And I guess the first question that you might want to ask with this title is, why such a legal focus? You know, it is very legal terminology in what is otherwise a project controls show. So what we've found, in my experience, in our company's experience, is that the legal prism gives a really good way to look at what you want to be controlling in a project. I think the best way to learn this is through the following story. So imagine 2 odd years ago, I was a new software provider offering what is essentially project controls. And I get a call from the person who was at the time our biggest client. There's a vice president in a tier 1 contractor. And he calls me up and he says, "Hey, Ari, I need you to build a claim for me." And of course, I have no idea what he's talking about. But vice president calls up, so you come and you take that meeting. And he explains that, hey, so we have this project. It's been heavily damaged because we had massive redesign and all the problems that are otherwise endemic in our industry. And we know the damage has been caused. We know it's being caused by the owner reps. We just don't have the data to build that argument, and we thought maybe you do. And as it happened, all of that data was already built into the project control system, and 24 hours later, they had the basis for what eventually became a very successful claim. And of course, being sort of a young startup, we took that to all the other customers and say, hey, look, we have this data for other customers. It's proved a very good basis for a claim. And it turns out that quite commonly, we already had that built in there. So 2 years later, we're working very often with expert witnesses and with lawyers, actually analyzing the legal side and going very, very deeply into the legalities of a project. And what we've learned throughout that is that the two things feed each other. They're very symbiotic. So essentially, if you're controlling the correct things in the project, you'll be prepared for what comes when there's a legal fallout. And if you're understanding the legalities, you're tracking what ought to have been controlled within the project as it ran along. So here's a bit of a map of what I'm going to try to walk you through today. So essentially, we're going to start out with understanding what is about burdens of proof and balancing of contracts, and specifically who needs to prove what and how that interplays with controls. Then dig deep into the endemic problem of margins within the industry in order to understand where the hidden margins are, where the issues, liabilities, and opportunities are around that. How that is often tipped, so how some contractors are making more, and finally, dig deeper into controlling those aspects which often today are not controlled. So, getting started, let's go to the idea of a burden of proof. So what I'm going to argue is that burden of proof is a very construction-y term. So it's defined as the obligation to prove what is asserted and in dispute. So if you think about it, that is pretty much anything we do within a construction project. And it also defines what we want to be putting controls on. Because if I say that a certain truck can travel that fast, no one will dispute it. So we don't need a project control to check that the truck can indeed drive that fast. However, if we're issued a completely new set of design, and that is going to dramatically change the scope of the works and the program, then perhaps what is going to ensue is going to be heavily disputed, and therefore we probably want to have a defined process to control it. In fact, you can rephrase that to say that effectively controlled activities are activities where if someone will dispute it, the data will be very clear to support one side or both sides. So in other words, if you're controlling an activity, that means that you have the processes in place to prove what happened in this activity. Because we can't always know exactly what's going to happen, but if we know exactly what went wrong and why, we are a long way towards improving the project. Which brings us to the idea of how do we keep a contract fair and balanced. I think in many ways this is what we as an industry ascribe to. Everyone wants it to be fair, to be balanced, and to be balanced for everyone. I think a really good exercise is looking at the idea of balance. Because we often use the first definition of balance, which is balance is fairness. It means that the contract is fair to both sides. However, there's a competing definition for balance, which is that balance as stability, right? If something is well balanced, it means it's stable, is robust. Now, note that within construction, these things oftentimes compete with each other. So for example, a very robust contract may be a lump sum contract with no questions asked, right? There's no problems, you just perform it as it is. However, that probably won't be a particularly fair contract. Whereas if you go down NEC Type C contract, then it will be very fair, but there will be a lot of friction along the way, and maybe it won't be as stable in reaching the same goal. But importantly in construction, when we think about how we want to set up the controls and the burdens, we need to not only, it's easy to be balanced and fair when we set out the contract, but how do you remain balanced and fair throughout the project? Because a project is not a static environment, it's a high pressure environment, and you need to maintain that balance and that fairness throughout. Now, as it turns out, we have a really well-established mechanism of doing it, which is throughout almost any contract we do, there is a simple route. There is a contractual right, then an event happens. This can be a variation, a disruption, unforeseen ground conditions, whatever it is, an event happens. That event creates damage, which in turn entitles compensation. And this is a method throughout all the uncertainty of the project to regain balance as it moves along. And I'd like to point out that the controlled activities are the middle. The controlled activities is understanding the events, how they were dealt with, and what the repercussions were. All the rest is quite clear. Now, of course, we all know this is quite the challenge within the context of large, sophisticated projects. Why? A, you need to account for multiple stakeholders. So fair and balanced for who? We have 20, 30, 50 stakeholders within a project. Interesting story. I mean, one of the first times I walked onto a construction site, this was a major build, and I walked into the project director's office. And as I walked in, he was on the phone to a superintendent telling him, you need to finish this activity now. I don't remember the exact activity, but it was a sort of urgent, do this now. Out of curiosity, I asked him why the urgency here specifically, I'd like to learn. And with a completely straight face to an absolute stranger, he says, well, I was just into the owner's office and I saw they're scrapping that area and we have a good price. And that is a result not of him being greedy, but of a contract that was built in such a way that the controlled activities is you need to perform those aspects for which you have a good price while you're still instructed to do so. Right? So the question is, how do you build a contract that doesn't lead to that kind of behavior? Secondly, of course, it's in a complex environment. How do you capture data underground? How do you know exactly who's transferring knowledge to who? We're dealing with immense amounts of uncertainty and change, and we're doing this for a long term. So what seems fair and balanced now may seem very different in 5 years' time when the price of steel has increased fourfold, and suddenly that contract is very uncomfortable for me. Right? We're doing this to an incredibly low margin of error. Throughout the construction, we need to deal with this constant balance of, is this fair or is this robust? Will this get done, or will it get done in a way that is good for everyone? But even before that, I think it's worth asking the question, what are we balancing in the first place? So when I talk about balance in a contract, I think I've never heard the discussion of what is it we want to balance? And I think that's a question worth asking. And I've asked myself that quite heavily, and the one answer I can come up with is the margins of the general contractor, right? The one constant throughout construction, across nations, across industries, across everything, is the general contractor is running on 1% to 3% margin. Now, the way I got to this is by essentially understanding it's a catastrophe, right? Because with a background in the tech industry, we know that it's important to run on a high margin, because then you can invest in the long term, you can collaborate, you can be flexible, you can do the kind of testing and innovation and investment in technology that is needed in order to succeed in the long term. So it's fine and mighty that Google are really innovative. They say, yeah, every employee can get the 5th day off of every week to work on the next big idea with no repercussions. But that works great when you're running to 80 or 90% margin. You can afford to do that. When you're working to 1 or 2, you can't invest in basic project controls, right? And it's so easy to fall into the trap that is just the way it is. It's 1% to 3% margin because it's a highly competitive market, and it kind of makes sense, right? You know, everyone's competing, competitive bid, same margins all around. But then you get deeper and deeper into the industry, and you ask yourself, why? And I don't think it's that obvious. So if you look across 2 projects, you have one project, it finishes on time, on budget. Another project runs a year and a half late. It's 50% or 100% or 200% over cost. You'd think that there'd be a difference in the profitability for the GC between those 2 contracts. I mean, it would make sense for the owner to incentivize the contractor to be on the left column. They're both making 1% to 3% margin when all is said and done in the vast majority of cases. I've seen projects with some of the smartest people, right? They're up in the project at 6 a.m., they're working weekends. I've seen other projects where you come in at 9 a.m. and people are starting to get together. You've seen projects that are collaborative, that work together, that achieve the goal, that are innovative. Then you see other projects where really they're just trying to get past. And you see projects that are run with a remarkable degree of commercial sophistication, whereas you see projects that are a straightforward lump sum without too much taking care. And they're all making 1% to 3% margin. Now, I don't accept that this is because it was competitive at the bid point. It does not make sense, or it does not make sense to me, that these projects will all be making the same margin for the general contractor. It doesn't seem healthy. And especially from the perspective of a software provider ultimately trying to increase the margin of contractors, it became a bit of an obsession to figure out who's beating the odds. So I started asking. So I'm asking project managers, controllers, executives, why is it always ends up at 1% to 3%? Being the geek that I am, I probably spent too many nights up reading the financials of contractors from different verticals to figure out why everyone ends up running to the same margin. And slowly I started finding those contractors that are beating the odds, that are making a higher margin. Most of them are not really general contractors. They're specialists just taking on general contracts. So they will do something very specific that they specialize in, or they will take very few bids. They're not really the big general contractors. But then right in my backyard, we found one Israeli company that is the exception to this rule. You can read their financials. They're called Shapir. They're publicly traded. They're consistently making 10% to 15% on their general contracting arm. And this is publicly tendered government competitive tenders, for major roads, infrastructure, maritime projects. Not the kind of thing that anywhere else is making this kind of profit. So you ask yourself, why? Why is this company beating the odds? Because if we can crack that, then we'll be in a very good place. And of course, they have the best engineers in the business, but so do all the other tier ones. They have really sophisticated commercials, project controls. They have a very stable financial standing. But really, so does everyone else. And when we dug deep, there was actually one thing that kept coming up. And it was distilled as the following rumor. It was the rumor that when they set up a job, first they send the lawyers, then they send the claim specialists, and only then they might send the first engineer out, right? And it kind of distills to this. They build on time on the budget, and then they claim like it wasn't built on time and budget. Now, I'm not telling you to do this. I don't think it's a good practice, and I don't think it's sustainable in the long run. If you want to do this, come contact us later. But I think there's a lot to be learned, because what are they claiming at? And from this, I personally started understanding what I believe is the balance of the margins in our industry. So it can be seen this way. You have a contract cost, which is the initial tender or wherever it is. And then throughout the contract, whatever contract it is, you're going to have additional scope, additional rights, and some of them are going to be claimed by the subcontractors and ultimately the general contractor. And then definitely you have unclaimed rights. So it stands to reason you always have some things you let go, some things you haven't tracked, some things you compromise against. And then the mechanism is actually quite simple. You build however you build, your cost ends up somewhere, and then you argue until you have 1% to 3% profit. Now, it's never this simple. Like you never want to leave money on the table. However, this is kind of what happens, because there are gentle mechanics. How much does the GC press the subcontractors? How much do you engage the expert witnesses and the lawyers? How tough are you when you're negotiating compensation events? The gentle mechanics lead to a situation where you're leaving that small margin, and after that, you're letting it go. Not directly, but inadvertently, that's what's happening. Whereas this company, they're keeping a tight ship, they're keeping their costs low, but then they're claiming much more of what is by contract their right. So I'm sure everyone at this stage is saying, yeah, that's wonderful, but where are all these rights that I've been looking for my entire career or trying to avoid my entire career? And the closest thing I can come to a direct answer is disruptions that are off the critical path, right? So let me run this by example. So we have a simple warehouse build, right? And it turns out to be a logistical nightmare. I thought that's funny. Anyway, so it turns out to be a 15-month instead of 9-month, and it cost 35 million instead of 20 million. And for argument's sake, let's agree that this is all entirely the owner's fault, because that always happens, right? So, contractors know how to deal with this. We have a delayed warehouse now, and we're not going to pay liquidated damage, and we're going to ask for loss of productivity and acceleration and site overheads, and probably the people who are guarding the entrance for the additional 6 months, and the crane, and the Uber that drove me there to assess it. But now, let me challenge that. What about if this is a delayed warehouse was in a successful airport build? And I'd hold that the majority of contractors would not be claiming most of what went on there. Now, it's true, you don't need to avoid the liquidated damage, but you still have loss of productivity and acceleration, you still have additional overheads for that section, you still have additional machinery and etc. But a significant, like most contractors will not be tracking just one small warehouse in what was otherwise a very successful build. And if a distinct warehouse may be tracked individually, may have its own tracking, what about the disrupted interior works on floor 3 on what was otherwise a successful skyscraper? No contractor in the world is tracking the productivity of the works on floor 3 after you're already higher up and it's way off the critical path. Which is to say, the disruptions off the critical path are broadly unaccounted for. And I think this may be a good time to define disruption. So, I did not want to do this. Sorry, I lost my presentation somehow. Yeah, and now we're going to do a lot of clicking. Sorry about this. Great. Right. So, a disruption is defined by the Society of Construction Law as distinct from delay is a disturbance, hindrance, or interruption to a contractor's normal working methods resulting in lower efficiency. Now, if we go back to our generic sort of control of how we rebalance contracts, under most contracts, you should be that is odd. That you should be compensable for that. So we have an event, a disruption, leads to a damage that should be compensable. However, the practicality of that really doesn't work that way. And the reason for that is that when we actually rebalance contracts under current contracts, there are only really two routes to do it. The first is scope or quantum. So basically, the scope of information works has changed, and as a result, we have a compensation event. And that is fairly straightforward if you can keep track of all the information works. And the second is time. And the way time works is you have a delaying event, which causes an extension of time, which in turn leads to loss of productivity and acceleration. Now, no, loss of productivity is only coming into play once we have time. And in fact, we calculate productivity through time. So if you think about it, the way the industry calculates loss of productivity is it should have taken a month with these resources. It took 2 months, so we were at 50% productivity. Now, the thing is, we calculate time through critical path analysis. So if you have a loss of productivity that is off the critical path, we rarely have in place a control to catch where that productivity went. Because if we didn't analyze it for delays, because if it's not on the critical path, we're not analyzing it for productivity, right? Now, I'm not for a second putting a doubt of the critical path. Like, the critical path is an incredibly powerful tool to get everyone looking at those most critical activities to make a robust program and push the project over the finishing line. Just saying, the critical path shouldn't look like this, as in the only path you can walk on, and everything else is down there, and we don't care about it. Right? And extending this, let me ask the following question. Right? How many disruptions do we have off the critical path? If we're putting all of our managerial skills onto the critical path, if we're putting all of our controls, the software is oriented to it, the programming, the management is oriented to the critical path, and we're late often enough, aren't we? Like, we get delayed on the critical path every single day. How many delays are we having where we're not putting our attention, where we're not focusing, where we're not putting controls to minimize those delays? Right? Which leads me to the following assertion, which is, if you have even as many disruptions off the critical path as you have delays on it, and you probably have many more, depending on your position in the contract, disruptions of the critical path are either huge risk and liability or a remarkable opportunity, right? Because there are a lot of rights there that someone isn't claiming, and you're either going to potentially be paying them or potentially get paid for them. I'll go further to say that not looking won't save you, right? That train is actually coming, and it's going to hit you, right? And the reason is that the world is changing. So there is more digitization. There is going to be more information captured. These controls are inadvertently going to be captured. And with the increasing squeezing of contractors, it is going to come up. Now, the other thing that's bringing this up is the resurgence of the global claim, which has fallen out of grace and has lately come up. So let me just give an example that we worked out. So this was a global claim for design changes, was known as design liability, so your typical scope creep, and also typical and endemic to the industry. No one had any idea what went on and why it took too much time. So what happened was, at a very high level, we were able to put together the idea that, hey, here are a few thousand events, all of significance, all which form liability for the owner, that probably explain a lot of our loss of productivity that we think is this much. And it is extremely hard to argue with this. If you get this from a subcontractor or a contractor, it is extremely hard to argue, especially when it comes with more organized data, such as a distribution of design instructions, including new ones and old ones, and the parts I obviously can't show you with specific changes, how they affected specific events, and the connection to the program that you'd obviously do. But the point is that with fairly little effort, there's the ability to actually capture that full loss. Which brings us to the question of, if we're saying that we need to control, or we need to put a burden of proof on that which matters in the case of a dispute, how do we control more activities than we are today? Because if we're controlling primarily the critical path, and we have all these activities, how do we control more? So here's a few solutions. The first is that you can have, as everyone tells you to, a fully weighted, up-to-date program that includes for all activities throughout the project that is constantly updated, is kept full, has records and documentations to back it, and everyone agrees about it. I am still waiting to see that project, by the way. I'd love to. Please invite me. I mean, I really want to see it. But the second option is essentially what most of the industry is doing, which is hide information, shout when challenged, and pray that it doesn't come up in court. I do not condone that. The third one, which is what I think is the obvious solution, is to dig deep and engage. So I think it comes down to going deeper into what's going on, to understanding what is the essence of this project, where is it going? And the answer is, you will only really know what is there once you get digging. So how many times does a planner get this sort of disturbed message from a design manager or coordinator saying, hey, does this plan account for that 1,000 drawing batch that we got last month? And he says, yeah, sure, we've got that covered. How many times do you sit in a meeting with a subcontractor and you get that air that something is going wrong and we're just going to wait and see what comes? And the answer is, that is obviously the easiest thing to do. But if you actually dig deep, these things will come up and they will fall under control. And the second part of that is you need to engage. Right? It's not enough to know there are problems. You need to properly tackle them and get dirty, and preferably do so fast. Right? So one of the most inspirational managerial quotes I've heard from, in this case, it's a Silicon Valley leader whose name eludes me, but it's not my idea. He used to say, I wake up in the morning, I think, what is the task I least want to do? And then I go and do that. And then I find the task I next least want to do, and then I go and do that. Because if I'm going to those places that are a bit scary, where all the secrets are and where everything is hidden, that is where we need to be looking. That is what we need to be balancing and controlling within a contract in order to get those liabilities, to get those questions out in the air and sorted, oftentimes before they accrue and in a solution to everyone, but if not, at least to have an educated guess against them. Now, I know that's vague, so I think something very practical, and in a second I'll advocate one, but really, if you choose almost any prism and you dig deep and engage, you will come up with most things. So if you have a contract and the project is really contract focused, so everyone across the supply chain knows exactly the contractual mechanisms, you talk about it, you constantly update the contractual controls, then design will be pulled into this. Then you will have to collaborate with other people. You will have to have an up-to-date program because you can't change the contract that way. Similarly, if you have a deep focus on getting the program right and updating it every month, you will have to have a discussion about the activities, and that will have to be informed by the design, and that will have to be in collaboration with the supply chain and the owner. So the thing is, the moment you choose any specific prism, dig really, really deep, the interconnectedness of a construction project actually leads you to uncover all of the other activities. Now, that still sounds a bit nebulous, and I wanted to do this without self-promoting, but it happens to be the most effective way to get the message across. So we happen to do this by digging deep in design. So essentially, we came up with the idea that says, if you make it cheap enough to see what changed between version and version, you can make it so every single stakeholder in the project is reviewing each design change. And that will inform everything else in the project, because the design either reflects or sort of condones all the other activities and the contract and the program, right? The program is ultimately building everything that was designed. Of course, you need to have some sort of mechanism around that. So build a sort of support structure that says you start with taking the design, you make it possible and easy to dig deep on the design, and then you branch out into the other aspects of project controls of a project. And suddenly, at a remarkably low price, you have the ability to have visibility into all of those issues in the project. Suddenly, you're tracking and you're balancing all of the activities that are out of nowhere. And let me sort of start wrapping up on the following note. I know this presentation may have sounded very legalistic, very contentious in a way, but I believe it's everyone's best interest to make it possible for everyone to make money in the best way. So if there is a certain activity that the owner is best placed to manage and to control and to keep track of, he should have that contractual responsibility and he should be taking upon that control. If a subcontractor is the best entity to do that, then he should be doing this. And it should all be interconnected. And what that leads is to projects where if you built on time and on budget, everyone should be making a little more money. And if you ran 100% over budget, maybe someone should be paying for that. So that's the first thing. It needs to serve the goals, the contract and the setup of the burdens of proof as an extension of that, of the project controls you put in place, the gateway, the logic, the forms. They're all about serving the goals of all the parties in a way that is fair and balanced. Second of all, it needs to be flexible and robust, right? So in order to do this, in order to look into the dark parts of the project and not just wait for the end for that global claim, you have to be able to disagree without breaking. You have to be able to bend rather than strong arm and break, but still do so in a way that does ultimately fill in to a legal stage. Third, you need to dig deep and engage. So again, it doesn't really matter which prism you're taking, so long as you're engaging with what's happening in the project on an ongoing basis, and you have some form of ability to track and control that, you will actually get there quite clearly. Next, control uncertain activities, right? So this, I didn't say this explicitly, but this was actually a thread throughout this talk. So you want to place burden of proof, or you want to be controlling and have controls in place for those things that will be in dispute, and they will be in dispute because they are uncertain. You want to have visibility off the critical path, because that is where all the hidden costs incur, and where ultimately, by the way, the delays often incur because they stack off the critical path and end up converging. So go for the dangerous, uncertain activities. It has to be communicative and collaborative, right? So this is sort of an offsetting to everything else I've been saying. If it's not sensible across the supply chain, it just converges into running one big dispute, which is how we did contracting 20 years ago, and it doesn't work. So it has to be that up front, we build those project controls to prove, so that we know what each side is proving, so that everyone is straight off on what we're doing. And finally, get effective tracking in place, because even if you get everything else wrong, if you have really effective documentation of everything that went on, it kind of becomes clear. Even if retrospectively, it works almost as good as doing this introspectively. I think that was a bit too much talking for this late in the day. So if anyone wants any questions, I think we have a couple of minutes left. Anyone? Or it's off for drinks, I guess? No? Okay, cool. So thank you very much. And if you want to come catch us, and I will be self-promoting over there. And I hope you enjoyed this.